won by a landslide. But Douglas's parting barb stuck. She coined the nickname Tricky Dicky. Seething resentment drove Nixon's political ruthlessness. His impoverished youth had left him with a deep grudge against America's privileged elite.
What starts the process really are laughs and slights and snubs when you are a kid. But if you are reasonably intelligent, and if your anger is deep enough and strong enough, you learn that you can change those attitudes by excellence, personal gut performance, while those who have everything are sitting on their fat butts.
Nixon's loathing was reserved particularly for the East Coast establishment.
The diffusion within the United States of subversive and un-American propaganda.
In fact, he made his political name in the hearings that fingered top State Department diplomat Alger Hiss as a probable Soviet agent. Nixon's hatred of elite figures came from the gut. Hiss told Nixon grandly, "I graduated from Harvard. I heard your school was Whittier." Snubs like that made Nixon determined to nail Hiss. Nixon was the outsider, determined to maneuver his way to the top. He deliberately portrayed himself as the champion of Middle America, and his mix of commie bashing and populist politics catapulted him into the vice presidency, where he made a name for himself in foreign policy.
All over the Soviet Union. That's a fair bargain.
After 8 years playing understudy to Eisenhower, he ran for the presidency himself in 1960. His opponent was a daddy's boy from Harvard, John F. Kennedy, whose rich, womanizing father was determined to install his son in the White House. Nixon's relentless hard work on the campaign trail counted for little in the beauty contest of the first real television election, where each forced smile and awkward pose was played out on screen.
Let's look at the record. Is the United States standing still?
Although Nixon scored on the issues, the contrast between Kennedy's urbane good looks and his tense, sweaty face was a killer in their first debate. Nixon lost the election. The Eastern establishment had brought his irresistible rise to a shuddering halt. He then stood for the governorship of California, was defeated again, and conceded with a bitter speech aimed at the liberal media that he believed had shafted him.
As I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference.
Nothing could have been further from the truth. Nixon was simply regrouping for a new assault on the inner circle of power. The underdog was still determined to come out on top. The comeback was a typical mix of underhand maneuvers, ruthlessness, and hard work. At home, he won vital political allies campaigning for Republican candidates for Congress. Abroad, trips to Europe and Asia helped polish his credentials in foreign affairs. And as America became polarized between right and left in the angry 60s, Nixon positioned himself as spokesman for what he called the silent majority of law-abiding Americans. So he was ideally placed to exploit the country's deepening crisis in Vietnam. Launched by President Kennedy and fired up into a costly full-scale conflict by Lyndon Johnson, the Vietnam War had gone disastrously wrong. Americans were dying at the rate of 200 a week. Meanwhile, at home, Johnson's ruling Democratic Party was imploding. Its Chicago convention degenerated into a week of citywide rioting. With his political opponents on their knees, Nixon seized his opportunity.
When the strongest nation in the world can be tied down for 4 years in war in Vietnam without the end in sight, when a nation with the greatest tradition of rule of law is torn apart by unprecedented lawlessness, it's time for new leadership in the United States of America.
Wherever in the world he goes, doors open, people listen, things happen. Who is this man? Of course, Richard Nixon.
Running for the presidency once again in 1968, Nixon projected a new image, a dignified statesman, the unifier of his country.
Who's the one man we need in these troubled, dangerous times? Nixon's the one.
No doubt this was the kind of leader that Nixon aspired to be. But behind the scenes, the reality was rather different. Ever the anxious political outsider, Nixon instructed his staff to treat the campaign as what he called all-out war. In this war, no blow was too low. Publicly, Nixon talked peace in Vietnam, but behind the scenes, he arm-twisted South Vietnam to withdraw from President Johnson's peace talks. To win the election, he was prepared to undermine his opponent's bid to end the war. This time, his Machiavellian tactics worked. Nixon won. The outsider became the ultimate insider. Now Nixon had the chance to craft world peace on his own terms, leaving indelible footprints on the sands of time.
The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker. This honor now beckons America, the chance to help lead the world at last out of the valley of turmoil.
As president, Nixon's grand strategy was a new set of relations with Russia and China. But first, he had to resolve Vietnam. He was determined not to let his presidency, like Johnson's, be crippled by the war. So Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, plotted America's exit strategy. The president's double act with Kissinger became one of the most extraordinary political relationships of the 20th century. It would fuel Nixon's rise, but also his fall. On the surface, Nixon and Kissinger seemed an unlikely pair. The reclusive, workaholic son of a California grocer, and the sparkling Jewish intellectual, a childhood refugee from Hitler's Europe. Kissinger was an effervescent and gossipy socialite, the prize exhibit at Washington dinner parties. He cultivated his image as a ladies' man, ostentatiously dating movie stars such as Liv Ullmann and Jill St. John. But as with Nixon, things were not always what they seemed. One girlfriend commented wryly, "I don't think Henry was interested in sex. He didn't have time for it. Power for him may have been the aphrodisiac, but it was also the climax." Close observers noted that super-smooth Kissinger's nails were bitten down to the quick. He and Nixon were, in fact, essentially similar. Ambitious loners, obsessed about image and their place in history. And each was by nature deeply suspicious.
I believe very strongly that the position of a White House assistant is inconsistent with making public statements on substantive issues.
Natural conspirators, Nixon and Kissinger were sure that secrecy was the key to negotiating an end to the Vietnam War, to avoid the leaks and press comment that could smother their diplomacy before it had time to flourish. So Kissinger created a confidential back channel to the Kremlin and engineered secret talks with the Vietnamese. While Kissinger talked, Nixon acted with the same ruthlessness that had won him the presidency. Now he could do so with the full might of America's power. He aimed to bludgeon the communists to the negotiating table by round-the-clock bombing of Viet Cong sanctuaries in Cambodia. He wanted to shake Hanoi, let them know he didn't play by normal rules. He told his chief of staff,
I call it the madman theory, Bob. I want the North Vietnamese to believe I've reached the point where I might do anything to stop the war. We'll just slip the word to them that, for God's sake, you know Nixon is obsessed about communism. We can't restrain him when he's angry, and he has his hand on the nuclear button. And Ho Chi Minh will be in Paris in 2 days, begging for peace.
But the quick fix didn't work. Madman tactics failed to end the war as Nixon had hoped. In fact, his saturation bombing provoked a backlash at home, fueling mounting public protest and press criticism. But Nixon, convinced that he was right, became ever more entrenched. He liked to claim that he wasn't bothered about his media image, unlike his narcissistic predecessor Lyndon Johnson, who had TVs in almost every room of the White House. But in fact, Nixon insisted on a daily news summary, often running to 50 pages, on which he'd scribble comments frenziedly. Over the years, he'd accumulated a list of friendly editors, reporters, and commentators. He'd also built up an enemies list. Even minor criticism was enough to ensure inclusion. He would scrawl angrily to his aides. Note, Newsweek is loaded against us. Cut it out like we cut the Times. Nixon saw enemies on every side, encircling him. But I think he almost needed to be hated. That way he knew he was right. There was a kind of self-righteous masochism here, as well as paranoia. As the Vietnam War dragged on, Nixon's paranoia about his enemies at home intensified. Not just the student left, but the liberal democratic establishment and mainstream press. Raging about newspaper exposés of government policy, he even created a breaking and entering team to catch the perpetrators and plug the leaks. They were known as the plumbers. Nixon's den, which he'd